The last class was about the social theoretical assumptions of the programmatic argument we've been discussing in the course, especially the assumptions about the nature of regimes, their composition, how they change, their discontinuity in history. Today's class is about the normative direction of the argument. And I intend to approach this problem of the normative direction not from the standpoint of the ideas of any particular thinker, certainly not of my ideas, but from the standpoint of the historical traditions, the historical experience that bears on the struggle over the future of society. And in the last class, next week, there will be no presentation, and that class will be entirely devoted to the discussion of the concerns, the ideas, the questions that you bring. So I hope everyone will come prepared with questions, and we'll continue in the classroom only so long as your concerns justify the discussion. Now, in principle, the idea of the regime and of regime change, the idea of the institutional and ideological structure of a society and its transformation as the prime object of theoretical and practical ambition works together with a view of the normative direction. And let me begin today's class by giving you an example of how they work together, how the ideas about regimes and regime change work together with the ideas about our direction in history, the normative element in programmatic argument. A characteristic of the left and liberal ideas in the 19th century was the assumption that there was a kind of natural convergence or pre-established harmony between the conditions of our material progress and prosperity and the institutional conditions of our ascent, of our emancipation from entrenched schemes of social division and hierarchy. The lifting up of this grid of division and hierarchy that weighs on our relations to one another in the historical societies. Each faction of liberals and of leftists proposed a way, a solution, and they said, here's the solution, the classical system of liberal rights or the state control of the economy. Embrace our formula and you will be both rich and free. So it's this idea that there was a pre-established harmony between the institutional conditions of material progress and the institutional conditions of the emancipation of human life from entrenched social division and hierarchy. And among other things, from the class structure of society. Now, we today, at the beginning of the 21st century, in the early 21st century, are no longer easy to share in their optimism, in their idea of this natural convergence. And we are at risk of embracing the opposite dogma, that there is an insoluble and tragic contradiction between the institutional conditions of our material ascent, our prosperity, and the institutional conditions of our emancipation. But this negative doctrine is just as baseless as the positive doctrine that it seeks to replace. Now, remember the attributes of the theory of of regimes from the proto-social theory that I outlined last week. The regimes are structures, not systems. Their elements reinforce one another, but they do not together constitute an indivisible system. There is a relation between the elements of a regime and the achievement or fulfillment of functional advantages, the power, the collective power to produce or to destroy. But there's no one-to-one relation between any particular level of functional advantage and a particular institutional system. Any functional advantage can be supported by alternative institutional arrangements. The regimes in history are composed of the elements that are selected from the contingent sequences of practical and ideological conflict in history. They're not selected from some menu of the basic alternative systems available in history. They're selected from the accessible rivals or competitors. The third characteristic of regimes is the variability of their entrenchment. A regime can be constituted in such a way that it insulates itself, that it immunizes itself against challenge and change. And the more it insulates itself against transformation and change by a series of practical and ideological devices, the more we are inclined to naturalize it, to treat it as if it were inevitable, as if it were part of the furniture of the universe. This is the characteristic that I call entrenchment. To the extent that a structure, a regime, is entrenched, it controls or attempts to control its own succession. The past determines the future. But a regime can also be constituted in the opposite direction, to facilitate its own transformation. Now, and then the fourth characteristic of regimes that I highlighted in last week's discussion is that every programmatic proposal articulated in the vocabulary of the institutional and ideological assumptions that comprise a structure can be also articulated in a second language about the social and political alliances on which its development depends. It's not as if the alliances, the coalitions of interest or identity, were an instrumental afterthought. They're another way of understanding the programmatic proposal. Every project, every transformative project in history proposes and develops its own constituency. But, and here is the significant difference between this view and the Marxist view, there are always alternative ways to define and defend a group interest. And in particular, there is always a duality, a division between a way of defining and defending the group or the class interest that is institutionally conservative and socially exclusive, and another family of ways of defining and defending the group interest that is institutionally transformative and socially solidaristic or inclusive. And I exemplified this duality of ways by relation to our interpretation today of the interests of the organized working class headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of industry, declining industry. And I also exemplified it in relation to our way of understanding and developing the interests of what I call the subjective bourgeoisie. The great majority of humanity in the large societies of the world today that is poor and disorganized, but has a horizon of aspiration that is more petty bourgeois than proletariat. And that by default seeks then traditional, archaic, retrograde family business for lack of other options. Now I say all of this just to give my example about the way in which ideas about regimes interact with ideas about normative directions. So the hopeful, empirical, experimental view of the problem of the pre-established harmony, the automatic convergence of the institutional conditions of material progress and the institutional conditions of emancipation from entrenched social division and hierarchy, is that there's no pre-established harmony. There's no automatic convergence. But nevertheless, there is a zone of possible, of potential intersection between the institutional conditions of our material progress and the institutional conditions of our emancipation. In other words, there is a subset of the institutional conditions of our material progress that also serves our emancipation, and there is a subset of the institutional conditions of our emancipation that serves our material progress. And our interest, our supreme interest, is to identify this zone of intersection between the material conditions of our material ascent and the material conditions of our emancipation. And now comes the polemical thesis. The polemical thesis is that an attribute of the institutions that lie in this zone of intersection and that contribute to both our material empowerment and our moral or social emancipation is that they have this characteristic of moving toward disentrenchment. They facilitate their own revision in the light of experience. So our material progress depends on this ability to recombine factors of production, to innovate more radically and more generally, to untie our hands in the ways in which we cooperate with one another. That's the basic logic behind the idea that our plasticity serves our material progress. But by the same token, the plasticity of social arrangements, their susceptibility to challenge and change, the deepening of their revisability also serves our emancipation. Because one of the characteristics of any set of institutional arrangements and assumptions that maintains a fixed hierarchy and division in society is that they naturalize themselves. They present themselves to us as if they were inevitable. And they, in fact, impede all our practical attempts to challenge and change them. Now, before returning to the normative argument that I began at the end of class last week, let me present once again an idea that I brought up at the beginning of the course. And it's the idea of world revolution and its future. So I said then, we live in what may turn out to be a counter-revolutionary interlude in a long revolutionary period in the history of humanity, which has extended for something like 300 years. And this revolutionary project, which has set the world on fire, the whole world, has two sides. A political side and a personalist side. On its political side, it promises to lift the grid of social division and hierarchy that weighs on our relations to one another. To emancipate society from the class structure and from all forms of established, entrenched social division and hierarchy. And it is carried, this project, on its political side, by the doctrines of liberalism, socialism, and democracy. That's the political side of the revolutionary project. The personalist side of the revolutionary project promises to ordinary men and women that they are not so ordinary after all, and that they can ascend to a higher form of life, that they can increase their quota in the divine attribute of transcendence and become more human by becoming more godlike. And on this second side, the personalist side, the revolutionary project has been carried above all by Romanticism. And now especially, not by the high cultural Romanticism, but by the global popular Romantic culture, the soap opera, film, popular music, resonating in every slum, in every village throughout the world, and carrying this sublime message to ordinary men and women. Now, this project, this revolutionary project with its two sides, the political side and the personalist side, which here in this course we've been exploring primarily on the political side. This project has been and remains today the most powerful project in the world. It has many enemies. It's far from being the only project in the world. But all of its enemies respond to its provocations. So it remains today the most powerful project in the world because despite everything, it continues to command the agenda. And its adversaries respond to it. But it is simultaneously now, as well as strong, weak. It is weak because its votaries, its adepts, its partisans, on both the political side and the personalist side, no longer know what its next steps should be. And therefore, according to the law of the Spirit, we can only maintain, we can only make live what we renounce and reinvent. If we're not able to discern with confidence the next steps, the adjacent possible, the accessible theirs, to which we can get from here, the project ceases to exist as a powerful force. It loses its incendiary, subversive, and transformative power. And this is how I see this, the state of this revolutionary project today, which therefore commands us, if we want this revolution to continue, to reinvent it in its substance and in its methods or forms. And that's the basic inspiration for the argument that I've been developing throughout the semester. Now then, in that light, let me return first to the two initial steps that I took at the end of class last week. First, reinterpreting the division between right and left, between the conservatives and the progressives. The canonical form of the ideological debate in the world today now is that the conservatives are the ones who prioritize freedom against the background of the established institutional arrangements and assumptions. And the progressives are the ones who prioritize equality against the same background. So, institutionally conservative social democracy, or its reduced form after being attacked by neoliberalism, which we call social liberalism. Is an example of this idea of the progressives or of the left. The market is the market. It's a huge instrument for the creation of wealth. Unfortunately, it also generates inequality. So we come after the fact and we humanize it. We attenuate its inequalities through progressive taxation and redistributive social spending. And I've argued when we were dealing with this at different moments in the course that redistribution must always be accessory to reorganization. And then what matters is the primary distribution of economic and educational advantage and opportunity. And that we cannot make up for vast inequalities simply by attempting to create a secondary or retrospective distribution. So how are we to reinterpret then the division between the progressives and the conservatives in the light of these ideas? Now, should we say, now, and in this contrast, it's superficial freedom against superficial equality. If the criterion of shallowness is acceptance of the established arrangements and assumptions. Now, what's the alternative to that? Is the alternative to that a deep equality? Is what we want a radical equality of outcome or circumstance? The answer, if we're to go by the guidance of history, of the history of political ideas, is no. No one really wants a radical equality of outcome or of circumstance. They don't want to be like the mythical ancient Spartans or ancient Romans, equal but poor. They want a society which is full of contradiction and possibility and creation and innovation and prevents an entrenched inequality because it is an onus, it is an incubus on our ability to participate in that collective life of a higher freedom. They don't want deep equality. What they want is deep freedom. And deep freedom is characterized by a demand for inclusion and equality only insofar as equality means not a radical identity of outcomes, but an ability to participate jointly and effectively in the same life. Equality in the exercise of agency, of the power to resist and to transform. And that then leads to the idea that we should reinterpret the division between the progressives and the conservatives as a contrast between deep freedom and shallow freedom or shallow equality. That is, on the standpoint of this reinterpretation of the division, the institutionally conservative social democrats or the social liberals are on the side of the conservatives. Now, what then become the criteria on this reinterpretation for the division between the right and the left. There are two criteria. One regards the method or the practice, and the other regards the goal. With respect to the method or the practice, what on this reinterpreted view would characterize the progressives, the left, is that they insist on pursuing their projects beyond the limits of the established institutional and ideological structure. And what characterizes the right or the conservatives is that they treat the established institutional and ideological framework as an unsurpassable horizon. Which is, of course, what the institutionally conservative social democrats and the social liberals do. And the second criteria, now, this idea that we can transgress the structure has to be understood not in the spirit of the Marxist idea of how revolutionary transformation takes place. Because the assumption is that real structural change, when it happens, is always fragmentary. It's not the substitution of one indivisible system by another. That's the old binary idea of politics, which is it's either reformist, lacking in structural ambition, or it has structural ambition, but it treats the structure as a system, as an indivisible system, which is either not replaced or replaced all at once. Now, the second criterion for distinguishing or contrasting the progressives and the conservatives has to do with the understanding of the goal. Who are the conservatives? The conservatives are the ones who think that it is natural for human life to be small. And those who are exempt from this fate of belittlement are an elite of innovators, geniuses, heroes, entrepreneurs, or whatever. The majority of men and women are temporarily freed from this fate of belittlement only in extreme circumstances, such as a great war, because then they're driven out of the long littleness of life and have a brief taste of what it would be to increase their quota in this godlike attribute of transcendence. And who are the progressives? The progressives are the ones who think it's not natural for human life to be small. And we can all ascend to a larger life with greater capabilities, with larger intensity, broader scope, provided that we ascend together. Now that would be a way of rescuing, but also radically reinterpreting the division between the right and the left. And the peculiarity of this division is that by its application, the near totality of the existing political forces in the contemporary world would have to be placed on the conservative side of the ledger. And the side which I call leftist, progressive, would be almost empty until we fill it up. Now, that was the first step. Motivated by this ambition of developing a space in which we can imagine the continuation of the revolutionary project, so that the fire can continue to burn in the world. The second step then, because after all, under this interpretation, the goal is freedom, deep freedom. Deep freedom understood as an expression of our divine attribute of transcendence, our participation in that attribute, our ability to increase our quota in it. So we have to ask, what is freedom? What is this power by which we seize on life and increase our possession of it? And the argument that I developed last week was that we should understand it as a series of contradictions. So it's not some essentialist idea of human nature, which we say. There's a small set of attributes that are invariant, and the rest is open to change. We can't classify what we're like into these two characteristics. The ones that history touches and the ones that it doesn't touch. Because history touches everything. Everything is up for grabs in history. Even the most intimate experiences, envy or jealousy, are modified by the context of society and culture. Nevertheless, we can form a general view of the human condition and of the contradictions and problems with which it confronts us. The first contradiction I said has to do with our relation, the relation of the self to the others. How are we freed? We're freed by being connected to others. No one is free disconnected. But the problem is that every connection threatens us with subjugation and loss of personal distinction. One of the elementary forms of connection is imitation. And Emerson said, imitation is suicide. So we have to be connected, but the connection threatens us with this loss of self. How then can we be free? We can be free only to the extent that we can connect without being subjugated, without this loss of personal distinction. And where in our experience do we have an example of that, an instance of this connection without subjugation? In personal love. To the extent that personal love is not like altruism, but has a cognitive and imaginative threshold. The initial requirement is the ability to imagine the other without making the other into a projection of some fantasy about ourselves. So in personal love, we have this experience of reciprocal acceptance founded on mutual insight or imagination, in which we can be connected without losing ourselves. But it cannot flourish outside intimacy. Now, we are commanded to love the stranger, but seems to be a commandment that we are unable to implement. Therefore, the moral philosophers offer us instead the cold comfort of an impersonal and altruistic benevolence. What is the real counterpart to personal love in life among strangers? The counterpart is cooperation, especially cooperation among free and equal agents. But the actual institutional forms of cooperation in the market or in democracy are always the object of a struggle, of a contest in history. That's what we've been discussing during the semester. The different species of this contest and the direction they can and should take. The second domain in which the idea or the experience of freedom is developed is not the relation to particular people, but the relation to a whole society. To be free, we have to participate in a world. No one is free alone. But every participation in a particular world, in a particular society, every engagement with a real society seems to require as the price of the engagement that we surrender to that world, and then we're not free. So we're not free if we're marginalized, if we're not participating, but we're not free if in order to participate, we have to surrender. To be free, we would have to be able to participate, but to deny to the collective world the last word, and to keep the last word for ourselves. Or to change the vocabulary, to be free, we would need to be able to be insiders and outsiders at the same time. And indeed, societies and cultures may differ in the extent to which they allow us to do that, to which they allow us to participate in them, but at the same time to resist them. And that is also freedom. That's what freedom means. That's the second meaning of freedom. Now there's a third domain of the relation of the self to itself. To be free, we have to develop a habitual form of being in the world, a form of action, a way of being. That's what the Greeks call character, and they said character is destiny. But the character can become like an icon. So Nietzsche, for example, said, the life should become a work of art. Like you chisel yourself, you'll make yourself into a monument, an icon. You'll chisel the stone. But then won't you become the stone? Won't this icon suck the life out of you once you've chiseled it and made it perfect into a work of art? So this is this third contradiction or paradox in the nature of freedom. To be free, we have to form this habitual way of being, but at the same time, we must be able to disrupt it, to reinvent ourselves. And indeed, different ways of living a life and different ways of organizing a society and a culture may enable or impede this activity of disruption of the character. So then the claim is that this is an example of how we might reinterpret the distinction between the progressives and the conservatives with respect to the goal. The goal is to create the human being, the form of life, which allows us to connect, to engage, to have this habitual way of being, but at the same time, not to pay the price of subjugation, of surrender, of powerlessness to disrupt the character that we have formed. And there you have the beginning of a normative direction which can interact with our ideas about regimes and regime change. Now, before going on to the next step, let me stop and ask whether you'd like to discuss some part of these claims. Yes.
So what moves horizons of aspirations?
What?
What moves horizons of aspirations, if not the material conditions?
What moves the majority of the population?
No, what moves the horizons of aspirations that you mentioned? How do you understand movement? How do we shift them upwards or downwards? Because you also talked about this.
Well, so for example, take what I said, the characteristic of what I call the subjective petty bourgeoisie.
Yeah.
Right? So what does it aspire to? It aspires to a modest prosperity and independence. It habitually identifies this prosperity and independence with the rigid, limited, regressive formula of traditional family business. So I said, the majority of men and women in the world, in the great populous societies of the world, want to have a little farm, a store, they want to apply a trade. And there's a problem because that regressive, that the default form of the aspiration of the ideal leads backward. Collectively, it doesn't create the atmosphere propitious to a growth miracle in the society, an explosive ascent. It's not a fantastic solution even for the individual and his family. It's just a way of getting by. Nevertheless, the idea that motivates it is a noble idea, a high idea. So the idea of ascending to a modest prosperity and independence that extends the power of agency. So how was this changed as a practical matter? There I made this argument that it would be necessary for there to be a counter-elite that arises in the society, for that counter-elite to oppose the elite of rentiers, of financial or natural resource rentiers, and then to seek to garner support in the majority, which is the subjective petty bourgeoisie, and offer them alternatives to the regressive form which their ambition takes. That's the argument. Now, so you ask, how do you change the direction of their aspiration? You change the direction of their aspirations by offering them practical installments on this alternative idea. That is to say, let's for taking now the present circumstances of the economy in the world. Let's try and put them on this escalator, on this road to a knowledge economy for the many. So for example, even in the agricultural sector, we could say there'll be progressive industrialization of the agricultural and ranching products. There'll be intensification of ranching, more cattle per acre, and so forth. And that's just to show that even in the primary sector, there can be the knowledge economy. So what's the effect of that on consciousness? It's to create a more complicated life with more possibilities. So instead of an empty countryside with large agribusinesses, a great variety of forms of production, of middle-sized cities, not just empty countryside versus big conurbation, and a more complicated cultural life. So I think the method of political prophecy and of practical transformation requires the prophet to have people touch the wound. That is, they have to see a practical installment, a prefigurement of the future that is promised. Something now in which they can have a foretaste of the alternative. That's the basic answer. It's not enough just to have an abstract doctrine. And in countries that are large and unequal and varied, there's an enormous importance of regional policy, because the national project has been brought down to earth and translated into the realities and possibilities of the different regions. So then there's a kind of concert of alternative vanguards in the country. So I think a fundamental part of the answer to your question is, you offer little things as a foretaste of big things, and you increase the degree of complication and contradiction in the society and in the culture. Complexity, and on the basis of complexity, contradiction. That's the general character of response to the problem that you raise. Yes?
One part I'm curious about is connection between people and the way that that would need to be strengthened beyond sort of just connection to the person and their family.
Yes.
And what I'm curious about is,
You mean connection in the sense of what the sociologists call social capital, for example?
yeah, or care or compassion for other people
Yes.
within the state, sort of beyond their own self-interest.
Yes.
And it sounds like that requires some level of individual transformation. And I'm curious to the extent that government is a part of that intervention, or if you're hoping that
I think let's
through
separate it,
economic
because you, in your very interesting statement and question just now, you've combined two elements, right? You began by alluding to connection, which seemed to be social, but then later you spoke about the transformation of the individual. Now, one of the things that one learns in political engagement very quickly is that it's easier to change a country than it is to change a person. So the transformation of a country only requires you to be a statesman. But the transformation of a person requires you to be Christ. I mean, that's for the Redeemer. So that's a higher level of ambition, right? But I think that the transformation, so I think that the disposition to cooperative action and the densification, if you like, the thickening of the relations among people can be an object of deliberate action. I don't think that it's just an invariant feature of a culture, of a society. It's something that you can change. Now, how do you change it? You change it by a combined set of initiatives. So, for example, the cooperative character of education. It begins in the school. Not because the school preaches cooperation, but because it exemplifies cooperation. Then, in the provision of public services, we have this argument. All we have in the world now, by way of the provision of public services, is what you could call administrative Fordism, right? It's the provision of low-quality, standardized services by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. And the only alternative to that seems to be the privatization of public services in favor of profit-driven firms. But there's another alternative, which we discussed, which is that the state help organize, equip, finance, monitor independent civil society, so that it, through cooperatives of specialists, like health workers and education workers, can partner with the state in the experimentalist provision of public services. The state provides a universal floor of services to the citizens. The state operates at the ceiling in the development of the costliest and most complex services, but in the broad middle zone, the state partners with independent civil society. And I want to argue that's both the most promising way in which to enhance the quality of the services and the strongest instigation to the organization of civil society outside the state. Then you could say, social service, voluntary or mandatory, as a supplement to mandatory military service. Everyone should serve, and they should serve beyond the boundaries of family selfishness at some moment in their lives. And so there can be a combined set of initiatives, the cumulative effect of which is to enhance this thickening of the social relations and disposition to cooperate. One thing that we learned in social democracy is that compensatory redistribution, meaning people making sacrifices for the sake of other people's children, works much better when the nation is a little tribe, like these European social democracies used to be. The people looked alike, they spoke alike, they had the same religion, the same attitudes. Once they become different, then the inadequacy of money transfers organized by the state, as a social cement, becomes manifest. So money is not enough. What is enough is purposeful action, collaboration, doing things together, uniting people who come from different walks of life, from different parts of society, to do things together with a common purpose. That's the real basis of social solidarity. But that doesn't resolve your other problem of the transformation of the individual. As I say, that's a higher level of ambition. I'm not going to guarantee you that we're going to therefore change the heart.
But are you saying that changing the heart is necessary for this divinization of humanity?
No, so I think that's very interesting, because this, of course, is a question that arises in political transformation. Whether it can regenerate the human being, right? And this was, after all, a characteristic idea of some socialists at some moment. They create a new man, a new human being. So with respect to this problem, I think the only reliable assumption about human nature is, what is human nature? Human nature is what we are like now. That has to be the default assumption. And can we change it? The basic answer is everything we do will tend to change it in some direction, because, as I say, the way we are is up for grabs in history and is influenced by everything. But the safest assumption is that we can change it only at the margin. And nothing in our political plan should depend on the idea of a sudden regeneration, a sudden shift in what we're like now. The safest assumption is that we will continue to be what we are like now, which will be influenced at the margin through these transformations, like these transformations that increase our disposition to cooperate. Is that a satisfactory answer to your question?
I guess I feel a little stuck that we would, because we don't carry that same limit for a market having a necessary and natural form. So why would we apply
stop.
human interaction. So, but now you've changed it, because now I'm not sure whether you're speaking
Well,
about.
I mean, interaction in terms of social fabric that we're talking about, or
Uh-huh.
thinking of those policies.
So I think, I want to be careful now in how I respond, because I think we can alter the conditions that lead us to cooperate, right? We can create pegs, hooks, instigations to cooperative action. So I do believe that the disposition to cooperate is not just a natural constant, it is a variable, and that we can create situations which tend to enhance our disposition to cooperate. And I gave the example of this set of changes, which all go in the direction of enhancing our ability to cooperate. And the most powerful, so the fundamental distinction is, does cooperation depend on antecedent similarity? Or can cooperation result from common action and common purpose by people who are dissimilar? That's a higher form of cooperation, because then the work is not being done by the antecedent similarity. And I think we can. How far we can, who knows? That's empirical, but we do know that we can change that. And create the conditions in which solidarity can express itself more amply in social life. But I still don't think that opportunity to express solidarity resolves our fundamental ambivalence to one another. So we still sin, we still have evil, we still have hatred. Every human being still has this ineradicable ambivalence to other human beings. And I'm not going to promise you that we're going to extirpate that. That's who we are. Other questions? Yes.
So, as I understood it, you proposed like two different sets of criteria we can use to evaluate whether an individual was progressive or conservative. One based on the goals and the other based on kind of their stance relative to institutions.
One about the transgression of the horizon,
Right.
and the other about life being big or small.
So, I think I can imagine scenarios where someone believes life should be big for all people, and that can be accomplished within our institutions, or vice versa. How does that, what they believe that's, maybe someone else doesn't see that in their policies?
But what's the question that you're asking?
So
Because
the-
it seems to me that this is a question which relates to this problem of the counter-revolutionary interlude that I mentioned. So remember, in War and Peace, Pierre, the protagonist, looks up at the sky and he sees Halley's Comet. And Halley's Comet is a presage of Napoleon's invasion of Russia. And he feels that everything will change. He will be lifted out of this rut, right, this routine, to a larger life. Because of this terrible thing is going to happen, which is going to shake everything up. Now, what's the relation of this to us? What happens to us if our lives happen to have fallen in some period between the visitations of the comet? The comet comes, say, every 90 years or whatever it is the Halley's Comet comes. And we just happen to have lived and died in between one visit and another. So we for our lives to have this heroic quality and this opportunity for transcendence, it would be necessary for this exogenous event to happen. Well, do we want that? Or can we substitute for the comet by some action that we take? And I want to think in the spirit of these ideas that have been predominant in the West, that to some extent action and imagination can make up for exogenous trauma. So the imagination can do the work of crisis without crisis. I hope. But this is a conjecture to be enacted, to be tested. But that's how the problem arises. Is there some other aspect of this question that you?
I'm thinking more about like the classification piece of it. Would you then only classify someone as progressive or a policy proposal as progressive if it's doing both reimagining the horizon and seeking to create big?
But that's not the spirit, right? The spirit is not the spirit of classification. It's like I'm distributing gold stars and black stars to people. That's not the spirit. The spirit is, see, what's the direction of the future? How do we get out of this? Now we all know, so that there's stuff that we can't change, like death, right? We all know that we're not going to get out of here alive. But the question is whether in the period of our existence, we can, before we go to the grave, we can have this taste of this higher thing. And not just as a mysterious or romantic interlude, but as part of the elevation of human life. Yes?
Are there other parallels in history where the democratization of a knowledge economy in the past has led to emancipatory change?
As what?
Has led to emancipatory change. So you talked about this one specific hinge point in American history where it was possible to empower guild owners to democratize a specific set of knowledge in order to create this economy of, let's say, small farmers. But are there other parallels in history where the democratization of knowledge has led to sort of the change that the left would want?
You're alluding to that example that I gave of American history in the period before the Civil War, right? So I said there was, and that example is a very good model of one of the ways in which things happen or fail to happen. So, because in the United States there were two different societies. There was a slave order in the South. In the North, it was an economy of a petty bourgeois economy. One white man in 5 worked for another white man. So it's basically an economy of small-scale proprietors and artisans. And there were these two projects. The nascent national elite, which was a plutocratic elite also, clustered around Alexander Hamilton, who was the developmentalist ideologist in the United States, had a project, it was a Nasserite project of building the country, a nationalist Nasserite project in the vocabulary of the 20th century. And then down below, there was a project for the selective democratization of what were then the two crucial sectors of the American economy, which were agriculture and finance. And the Americans developed a family-scale agriculture with entrepreneurial characteristics. They existed nowhere else in the world. And in finance, they disbanded the National Bank in the presidency of Andrew Jackson and organized the most decentralized system of credit that's ever existed in the world, at the disposal of the local producer. For more than 100 years, any bank was prohibited from operating in more than one state of the union. So if something built the United States, that's what built the United States, this interaction between the developmental project on top and the selective democratization of the sectors below. That's the positive example. But that interaction between mobilization above of resources, national mobilization of resources, selective democratization, became progressively weaker in subsequent moments of American history. Then this is also an interesting part of the story. Why did it become weaker? It became weaker for, I think, two reasons. The weakness of politics and the weakness of thought. So politics was weak because the Americans had organized in their constitution was in effect a proto-democratic liberalism. It wasn't a real democracy. And it was designed to filter out popular influence in all sorts of ways. And the weakness of democracy later made possible the ascent of corporate power and the marriage of corporate power with high finance under the watchful eyes of a submissive state. The other thing was the weakness of thought. So I say this selective democratization of agriculture and of finance were examples of a more general idea, which is that the market economy has no single natural and necessary form. We can reinvent it. But that's the idea that I stated. The Americans didn't state that idea. They didn't develop this idea. To the extent that it developed at all was through the result of the transformation of legal thought at the end of the 19th century or the beginning of the 20th century. It was not an idea which occurred to them. So they didn't have this doctrine that they were embarked on this experiment with the form of the market. And the absence of the idea of the doctrine of it was also a crucial weakness. So I would say it was these two weaknesses that bound them together, that shackle them, and that help explain then the subsequent evolution, why they were unable to continue this virtuous dialectic between the mass mobilization, the resource mobilization on top, and the selective democratization below. So and that kind of example on both the positive and negative side is what history is full of. So, but in order for those things to count as examples, we have to have the idea, right? And the Americans didn't have the idea. Yes?
I was curious, when I was thinking about the paper and thinking about cases like Sri Lanka over the last few years, thinking about Bangladesh, Pakistan over the last few years, or even India. It seems like for these countries, finance and global markets or global capital move across markets and state boundaries in such a way where this level of coordination between corporations and governments for a sort of growth that does not lead to the complete destruction of the working class is not even possible. Like it's not even in the hands of somebody like Modi or Shehbaz Sharif or anybody in order to establish sovereignty over the economy in a way because capital flies so quickly across the planet and finance moves in such an effective way that you can't have this sort of like steady development coalition between corporates and government anymore.
But what are you saying then? Because for me as a foreigner, and Modi is an example of, so his base is a petty bourgeois base, right? But he hasn't actively promoted a popular capitalism, right? On the contrary, he's made deals with the Indian plutocracy. So the right hasn't taken the opportunity to have a program, a project, which would go in the direction of its own base. Right? That's what seems to me from afar to be the case. So what I wanted to develop this now is not to state some doctrine or philosophy of mine or of anyone else, but to speak about certain impersonal elements in the development of our civilization that are the sources of normative direction and suggest in what respect they are defective or not. So, of course, one is classical liberalism, the classical liberal theory of rights. And its theoretical basis is the idea that there is an impersonal or neutral framework of right within which people, individuals, and groups with different sectarian visions of the good can coexist. And the objection is that there is no neutral framework of right. Every institutional order tilts the scales of experience, favors some sets of experience and disfavors others. There's no neutral experience. There's no neutral framework. And the idea of neutrality is always adduced in favor of its opposite, because it's a way of entrenching, immunizing the system against attack. Nevertheless, and this is the other part of the argument then, the false idea of the neutrality of a framework has a kinship to another idea which is legitimate and in fact indispensable, which is what we should want is that an institutional order be open to a wide range of contradictory experience, even though it can't be neutral. And then above all, it be corrigible in the light of experience. So contradiction and corrigibility are the legitimate counterparts to the illegitimate idea of neutrality. Now, furthermore then, the liberal system of rights developed on the basis of this false premise of neutrality is unable to deal with the partial and oppressive character of its practical instruments. So the problem with classical liberalism is the association of its idea of freedom with its contingent effective system of rights, like the unified property right, which then become the instruments of exclusion and subjugation in history. And because the instruments are limited and defective, the idea is also impoverished. In other words, if we began to diversify the system of rights, for example, with respect to property, like in the thought experiment that I proposed of the capitalism without capitalists, the investment funds that hold the major means of production of society, and then auction off the means of production to their most efficient users, we begin to change the idea of freedom. Because the idea of freedom, every political idea, every political abstraction like this always has a double reference. It has a reference to these abstract themes, but then it has a reference to the concrete legal and institutional background. If we change the legal and institutional background, we begin to move the abstraction. Well, that's classical liberalism now. Take another general idea, romanticism. What's the romantic idea of politics? The romantic idea is structures will always prevail, but we can shake their hold temporarily, and thus the contrast between romantic love and the routines of married life, or the mob in the street versus the bureaucratic apparatus. So the Cultural Revolution as opposed to the Chinese bureaucracy. So we're free in those interludes of the shaking. That's the moments in which we're fully human. But the structures will come back. They'll be like the hand of Midas. They'll freeze the spirit and kill the spirit. So it's a form of despair about our power to change the relation between spirit and structure. If spirit means the exercise of agency in the pursuit of transformation and transcendence, the idea we should have is that there isn't this fixed relation between spirit and structure. We can create structures that are more hospitable to the spirit over time. Now, what is the most powerful basis of our normative ideas in politics? They come from these world religions, using religion amply to include Buddhism, to include Confucianism, and in the reference to the so-called axial age, the period from the rise of prophetic Judaism toward the middle of the first millennium before Christ, to the prophetic activity of Muhammad in the middle of the first millennium after Christ. It's a 1,000-year period in which the major religious or existential orientations of humanity developed. Each of them anchoring an orientation to existence in a vision of reality. And each of them crossing the divide between the prescriptive and the descriptive. And each of them demanding to penetrate the totality of experience. Because one of the characteristics of religion is it demands to penetrate everything. It refuses to be cabined in any particular department of experience. A peculiarity of the United States is that its constitutional religion, its idea of law and politics, is heavily influenced by the middle period in the history of Protestantism, which was an anomaly in the history of religion, because contrary to the general impulse in religion, it accepted the idea of a privatization of religion. And this was eternal. This is totally contrary to the general direction of religion, including in Protestantism. So it wasn't true of the Protestantism of Luther and Calvin, and it wasn't true of contemporary Protestantism, of Protestantism of Karl Barth. This is the Protestantism of Madison and Schleiermacher. And it's a complete exception in the history of Protestantism. And that's left its mark on the political beliefs of the Americans. So these religions were radically different, but they had some things in common. Now, what did they have in common? Because that's the most profound basis of this normative orientation. So, first, they desanctified nature. Nature was no longer sacred. And they imagined the divine, the transcendent, as separate from nature. Second, they combine transcendence with immanence. The divine, separate from nature, would nevertheless have to come and visit the world and be embodied in the world. And an extreme example of this in Christianity is the theology of the incarnation. God becomes incarnate. A third characteristic of all these religious orientations, including the godless religions of Buddhism and Confucianism, is that they move the focus from our dependence on nature and the terrors of nature to the ineradicable flaws in the human condition. Our mortality, our groundlessness, and our insatiability. A third characteristic is that they denied that the divisions within humanity of class, of caste, of race, of culture, of nationality, went all the way down. They said, no, they don't go all the way down. They're all shallow or provisional. They don't deal with the core. And of course, there's some question of whether when they asserted that, they were proposing to transform or simply to redescribe. A fifth characteristic is that they promoted a moral revolution, which even now is extraordinary when you think of it. Because the dominant ethic in the agrarian bureaucratic empires that were, after all, the main protagonists in world history before the present revolutionary age, the dominant ethic was the ethic of proud self-assertion, of vengeance. It was the ethic of little boys. Don't diss me or I'll kill you. That was the dominant ethic of civilization. And now they promoted this ethic of universal fellow feeling. And the sixth characteristic of all of these religions is that they offered what was in effect a two-sided ticket, right? And this is the deepest ambivalence of these religions. One side of the ticket was a license to escape the world into another world. This is a nightmare from which we want to get out. And the other side of the ticket was an invitation to transform the world. Now, within these religions, of course, one subset were the Semitic monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. And now I want to say something about Christianity, because Christianity is, in our civilization, is the main basis of normative authority and direction. And what does it mean? How is one to understand the Orthodox Christian message? And this is a question that's much more complicated than it seems to be. It's much more complicated than it seems to be because the history of Christianity is in large part a history of heresy. The orthodox statements of the Christian doctrine are in general unsatisfactory. What are the two central themes in Christianity? The two central themes are, first, the primacy of love in the organization of our moral experience. That's the first theme. The second theme is the infinite. The individual human being is embodied spirit, spirit is the word by which we designate our transcendence. Everything in our experience points beyond itself. We're formed by context, by particular the social and conceptual worlds that we build and inhabit. But there's always more in us, in each of us individually, and in all of us collectively, than there is or ever can be in them. They are finite in relation to us, and we are infinite in relation to them. So I think these are the two deepest themes of Christianity. The primacy of love and the imperative or the possibility of transcendence. Yes?
For seeing that, like those are the two main themes of Christianity, and we're talking about how Christianity has like permeated all of our U.S. institutions and stuff. Do you think that those are the two central themes that like how Christianity has been implemented in our institutions?
No, not how it's been implemented, because I'm proposing an interpretation of the message of Christianity. But as I'm going to next say, this interpretation is in contrast to much or even to most of what Christianity has been interpreted to mean. So, I'm not a believer myself. I'm not a Christian, even though I was brought up as a Christian. I'm describing something central to my societies. The philosophers like Hegel saw themselves as devout Christians, but I think they were heretics. But it's a strange claim that I'm making, because I'm speaking as a non-Christian, and they are Christians, and I'm saying they were heretics. But I'll explain as I go. Yes?
I agree that also some of them are Christian, but at the same time, for a lot of these philosophers, couldn't they not be outwardly non-Christian?
Could they what?
They couldn't even be outwardly non-Christian, so like, yes, they might be Christian, but like, that could be just like a cover.
Well, what do you mean by saying they could not be non-Christian?
Like, a lot of times if we're like thinking, like, Hegel's like 19th century, I believe, but like,
Well, I think this is a strange feature of our civilization. So, is Shakespeare Christian? I mean, are the plays of Shakespeare Christian? I think it's doubtful. Is Hegel's philosophy Christian? I think that's also doubtful. So, many of the highest achievements in the civilization of the West are unthinkable without Christianity. But they're not really Christian. And they're in this uncertain relation to Christian orthodoxy. So I think that's just part of the complication of the situation. And the complication very great in this discourse of mine, because here I am proposing to describe what is orthodoxy and what is heresy. And I'm not a Christian. But so be it. I mean, that's the situation in which we find ourselves collectively of this doubt about the meaning. So let me go on for a moment, and then we'll come back to this. So there are these two themes: the theme of the primacy of love and the theme of the infinite. Now, I think the deepest question in the interpretation of Christianity is, what is the relation between these two themes? So you could say, it is in love that we most completely are able to view ourselves and one another as the context transcending originals formed in the image of God that we know ourselves to be. But the problem is that we're not completely these individuals. We must make ourselves into them in history. So history in Christianity, time and history are the decisive terrain of salvation. The work of salvation continues beyond history, but it begins in history. So the themes are connected, but the connection is not fully achieved or realized because we're not yet these agents who are able to love one another without ambivalence and to carry forward the work of salvation. Now, let's take each of the themes. So love. Love is, what are the canonical expressions of Christian ethics in Christian theology? One is the idea of Christian charity. And Christian charity is altruism. It's not love. Or the idea of the imitation of Christ. But can we really imitate Christ? Was the sacrifice of Christ a prefigurement of our sacrifice? Or did he sacrifice so that we would not have to be nailed to the cross? Love is not altruism. So altruism is from a distance. Altruism can require sacrifice, even the sacrifice of one's life, but no inner jeopardy. The price of love is vulnerability, a heightening of vulnerability. Our love can be rebuffed. It can be rejected. It can be destroyed. And it requires vulnerability. Love, unlike altruism, has a cognitive threshold. In love, the preliminary problem is our ability to imagine the other, to imagine the beloved. In altruism, there's no such cognitive threshold. So love is fundamentally different from altruism. Now take the other idea, the idea of the infinite. And it has been the object of perversions on two sides. And let me call those perversions in the spirit of patristic theology by the names of individuals. So let me call one the Hegelian heresy. So the Hegelian heresy is that there is, at least at the end of history, at the culmination of history, a form of life in which at last we will be at home. We'll have subjectivity, spirit, but we'll be able to have the spirit together with others in a real society. So that's what a Christian would call a form of Pelagianism, right? That salvation comes in history, and there is a form of life which has this status of representing the solution. The opposite heresy from the other side, let's say, is the Sartrean heresy, romantic, existentialist. All structure is death. Kierkegaard said, the war against routine is a war against life, because life is full of routine. But this romantic belief is structure is death. Denying that we can create structures that are relatively more hospitable to spirit over time. So that's the background of these normative arguments. Much more profound than any of the formulas of philosophers. The individual is embodied spirit. He's weighted down, he's diminished, but he has this transcendent power. The only acceptable relation to another human being is love. But love doesn't flourish outside the domain of intimacy in life among strangers. So we need this alternative. And we hope that cooperation will be the diminished, the limited, the relative form of love that can survive outside intimacy. But then we have the struggle in history over the forms of cooperation. Every form is imperfect. It's one imperfection against another. The different ways of organizing a market, the different ways of organizing a democracy. And in society, how can an individual who is destined to transcend all the particular determinations of his existence resign himself to a particular society? So we have to imagine that has this capacity of moving forward, and opening itself to revision, to challenge, and to change. So there's no definitive structure. There's no home for the human spirit in history. We're never at home, but one home is better than another. One structure is better than, we come closer, we move. So my suggestion is that the arguments we've been having about these political and economic alternatives can all be interpreted against this background of these ideas about humanity and history. And they're not the ideas of a particular believer. They're not my doctrine or the other person's doctrine. They're the most powerful revelation, the message that we collectively have received. And then we can be ambivalent about them in this way. Now, let me stop there and ask for your questions. So in a way, this discourse now at the end about the meaning of Christianity could be taken as an elucidation of the idea of deep freedom in the first part of the class, right, when I said. The aim of the progressives, properly understood, was never to humanize society. The aim was to divinize humanity. This was the aim of the classical liberals and socialists. This, not that we would literally become gods, but that we would increase our quota in this divine attribute of transcendence. Wow. Abdicating, not pretending to the divine attributes of omniscience and omnipotence and holiness. And then we would recognize this contradictory character of human experience. So then, viewed from that angle, the question becomes, in what form of social life, in what set of political and economic institutions by what method of education do we stand the best chance of living life in the Spirit? So, for example, as a human being gets older, a carapace of routine begins to form around him. It's the mummy. And in this mummy, we begin to die. And so, what do we have to do in order to come into possession of life while we're alive? It's to break out of the mummy. To break out of the mummy. Now, what is the role of the will in breaking out of the mummy? We can't, by an exercise of will, break out of the mummy directly, but we can put ourselves into situations in which we're not in charge, we're not in control, so that the mummy will dissolve. And what's then our objective? Our objective is to live in such a way that we can die only once. And then you can ask, in what form of social life, it's the political or economic question, do we stand the best chance of living in that way? That's the connection in which these theological ideas about the individual and his salvation come into connection with ideas about the improvement of society. Now, of course, this is very, very far and very, very distant from the temper of liberal political philosophy. Because the temper of liberal political philosophy requires us to think that these ideas about humanity and salvation have nothing to do with the organization of a free society. They have everything to do with it. Comments? Questions? All right, we have a week to think about this, and in our last class, I won't say anything. We'll just have an opportunity for conversation.
It's just this phrase that you mentioned in the book. It is
Last section is about
expectations also grow. They grew in such a way that it made very difficult the government feel how to deal with their new external needs. So this is why we're funding the conference.
I think you. The culture is basically a penny for culture. The majority of people have this aspiration, but the Colorado governments have not promoted a popular capitalism.
That's what I always say.
So that's their base. Trade their own.
Hi, we just had a question about paper and such.
course.
Yeah.
We're just wondering, I know you have office hours, but maybe you could stop by your office sometime next week. Just to
But I don't want to vet your papers in any way.
Okay, but like
I
our
don't want
topic
to say,
that
that's a good topic, that's a bad topic. I don't want to do that, because the whole point of this is for you to select your response, right? If I had in my head an idea, what's a good paper? What's the recipe for it? I would say so. That's not what I want.
I think our fear is just because like we're in the law student part of the class, that like the other students have had chances to write other papers, so it feels like this final paper is like our whole shot. So it feels a little scary that we're gonna miss something
Only the
important.
undergraduates have written it.
Right.
There are very few
Okay,
undergraduates. right?
okay,
So most of the people here are graduate students who are not
Right.
law students.
right,
So everyone's in the same boat.
Okay.
basically.
okay,
Uh, But I don't think you should be fearful that I somehow am expecting X or Y. If I expected X or Y, I wouldn't give this kind of an assignment. The whole purpose is to be surprised.
okay,
right? To get something which in form and substance is not what I was expecting. Truth is, I'm not expecting anything.
okay,
And I tell people that there's no maximum size of the papers, because my experience over the years is that now and then people write extraordinarily long paper, which is terrific. And it shows that they're launched on a literary or existential project of great meaning to them. And that's what I want.
I think it's just the law school has like ingrained it in us that like all of our professors want something very specific, so this is a nice change, we're
I
not
don't
used to
want
it.
be-
Yeah,
If I wanted something
Okay.
specific, I would say so.
okay, so as long as we hit on like the main ideas of the course and, like
I think
apply.
the point is not to repeat anything
No, no, no.
that's on the court, but I think the point is to engage
With those points, yeah.
with the spirit. I mean, this is incredibly difficult, right? I mean, for someone to make sense of the historical situation from the standpoint of a larger idea of possibility, because the dominant spirit of the time, of the culture, is a spirit of containment. Nothing is possible, nothing is realistic. And this is the opposite, so I think that for you individually, it's just an opportunity to be free of the change, the intellectual change, and explore what seems to you to be the interesting possibilities of transformation.
Okay, so it doesn't have to necessarily be like, because I think in that assignment it was saying to kind of not push back, but to critique some of the things we've discussed in class, so I was worried about
Critical
how much.
discussion doesn't mean you
Yeah.
have to polemicize.
Okay,
This
so-
or that.
Okay,
Critical discussion means you, with an independent mind,
yeah,
you discuss an idea.
okay,
It can be to take something that I said as a point of departure
yeah,
for a parallel elaboration.
okay,
It's not some kind of phony setup to attack.
Right,
You
okay.
can attack what you want to, but I'm much more interested